Today I'm going to talk to you about the origin and who the gods of voodoo are. So what is voodoo really? And why is there that story that you could make a little doll of someone using the person's hair or something like that? And then if you poked, for example, the doll's butt, the person would feel it. Is that thing true or not? Well, that's what we're going to see here today and much more. Voodoo has its origins in the Gulf of Guinea in countries like, for example, Benin and Nigeria. In the past, each family, each village would have their own spirits or their own gods, which are called or were called voodoo. That's where the name voodoo comes from. These gods manifested themselves in people through trance and also possession. With the rise of slavery, many people from Africa were forced to go to the Americas. But of course, these people brought their beliefs with them. And depending on where these people were left, their religions and beliefs mixed with the local culture. And from that, new religions emerged. For example, in Cuba, we have Santeria. In Haiti, Haitian Voodoo emerged. And in Brazil, our good old Brazil, we have Candomblé with the Orixás. In fact, the connection between Voodoo and Candomblé is very strong. For example, in Voodoo, we have Papa Legba, and in Brazil, we have Exu. If you research the age in Voodoo itself, you'll come across some peoples like the Faun, for example. And the main entity among the Faun is Nana Baruku, and she also ended up becoming an Orixá. There are other interesting facts too. For example, in the dubbed version, you can notice the connection between Candomblé and Voodoo as well. For example, in Everybody Hates Chris, they often talk about Voodoo, right? There's, for example, the Voodoo perfume, and there's that episode where a woman kind of casts a spell on Rochelle, and then everything starts going wrong, and later Rochelle has to apologize to her. But there's also a really cool scene in that episode where Chris kind of cheats on a test. I skipped to the end of the episode. Miss Morello goes to his house and says that he cheated. Then I don't know what Julius or someone says to her, and she says, "Oh, don't put your voodoo on me."
I didn't say that, but you thought it. Look, it's not very polite to do your voodoo work against white people.
And since in North America this voodoo thing isn't that well known, originally she says, "Don't do your voodoo on me," but you were thinking about it.
You know, it's really impolite to use your mind tricks against white people.
And just like the Orixás here, right? The mythology of the Orixás and Candomblé aren't exactly the same as what existed back in Africa. Haitian voodoo isn't the same as African voodoo. Actually, it's a mix of several things, like, for example, the African heritage, right? Several African peoples were forced to live together because of slavery. There are also elements of Christianity, of Catholicism, because the slaves were forced to adapt their beliefs because of their masters. And there's also kind of a mix with the indigenous culture, besides the fact that voodoo was also kind of a tool that people used to try to regain their freedom because of slavery. And also as a way to connect back with Africa, their homeland. The situation that the enslaved Africans found themselves in made it difficult or almost impossible for them to keep exactly the same beliefs and culture that they had back in Africa. They were separated from their families, separated from people they knew, so there wasn't much they could do. So you can get an idea of what happened and why they were forced to kind of mix their cultures, for example, with Catholicism. Missionaries at the time kind of used legends and myths to justify what they were doing to the Africans. For example, the curse of Ham, which was based on a biblical story, a legend that said Ham was sentenced to slavery. And they claimed that Ham had the same skin color as the Africans. And the Europeans and missionaries also said that actually the situation the Africans were in, kept in captivity and treated as property, was a favor they were doing for them, kind of leading them to salvation. Because according to the Europeans, Africans lived like barbarians there in Africa. In their view, Europe was the peak of humanity and so on. And as if all that wasn't enough, then came Louis XIV, who was a French king. Let me just make sure, Louis XIV, the French king. He created the Code Noir, or Black Code, which required all Africans there to convert to Catholicism, with the goal of trying to basically erase any religions that could emerge, and to ensure that the only one that existed there was the Catholic religion. So according to that law, any gathering among the enslaved people that wasn't for the purpose of practicing Catholicism was considered forbidden and dangerous. Here's an important detail. In the Code Noir, it wasn't just African religions that were forbidden, okay? Judaism and Protestantism were also prohibited. The only one that was allowed was the Roman Catholic faith, With any of the others, if you were caught, your fate wouldn't be very pleasant. Well, as you saw, there was no way for African people to directly worship their spirits or practice the religion they followed back in Africa. So what did they do? The same thing every animal and every human being does when things get tough. They adapt. And that's when the worship of the dead emerged. Well, for Africans of that time, they believed that when they died, their soul would return to Africa. The ritual surrounding death was very important to them. They performed hidden rituals to ensure that the soul of the deceased would find their ancestors and return to Africa. In a way, death for them was the path to freedom. Another thing they did was some dances on Sunday nights. The masters believed it was just a party their slaves were having to relax and work better on Monday, but in reality it wasn't. It was actually hidden rituals. With the drums and rhythms, the so-called kalendas were secret gatherings. With that, the Africans were able to keep, in a way, a bit of their ancestral culture, a bit of their original culture, and they also sent some messages of resistance against their masters without them noticing. But a place where voodoo really became established was the Marinage, though I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly here. In this case, Marinage would be like the Colombos in Brazil, places where enslaved people escaped to after fleeing forced labor. And it was in this place that voodoo became so strong that it was even used in a way to help bring about the war of liberation in the country. Well, another thing that also happened, which in a really rough way, to explain it in a really rough way, is basically the union of two religions. What happens? For example, in Brazil, we have the connection of some orixás with Catholic saints. For instance, Ogum with St. George, or Yemanja with Our Lady. Well, the same thing happened there in Haiti. What happened was this. The masters would come to the slaves and tell them to worship the Catholic images. So, for example, the slave would be there looking at Our Lady, but in his mind, no, he was thinking about one of his voodoo entities, you know? It was also a way to deceive the Europeans. And as I told you, voodoo was also the fuel for the Haitian Revolution. And to understand how Haiti became the first black republic in the world, we need to understand how religion also played a very important role in that. For example, one of the leaders of the revolution was McCandle. They said he was the master of poisons and that he could also transform himself, in other words, change his shape using rituals. For example, turning into a lizard to escape fire. He spread the idea that the white people would be defeated. And also in the middle of the Haitian Revolution, some new rituals ended up emerging. For example, the petro spirits would be spirits connected to anger and also to combat, all related to the revolution, right? Another thing they say happened was that in 1791, in a place in the forests, several leaders ended up gathering, led by Duddy Boukman and Cecile Fatiman. And in that, there was kind of a ritual there where they drank blood, making a pact of silence, and ended up swearing freedom or death. And weeks later, Haiti was in flames. And in the middle of the revolution itself, there was also a mix of religions. Because, for example, like I told you, there were rituals for the Loas, right? Which would be the voodoo entities. Some people also claim to see visions of the Virgin Mary wanting to free the Haitian people. But just so you understand the importance of voodoo and its origin as well, now let's talk about the religion itself, starting with the temples. The temple of the voodoo spirits, that is, the temple of the Loas, was called Omphor. And in these temples, the ones who performed the rituals were the priests, right? The so-called Ongan, who were the men. But unlike many other religions, women also had a lot of importance in voodoo. So they could also be in the temples as priestesses, called mambo. And in front of each temple, usually there was also a tree, right? The calabash tree, which in this case was the residence of the Loa Legba. Well, if you went into one of these temples, you might find it a bit strange because you would see several images of Catholic saints there. But as I already told you, these saints, even though they are Catholic images, represented the Loas. These images were kind of kept in a little chamber called the Kaimis. And along with the image, there were also several objects that kind of represented the personality of the Loas. For example, the Loa Exili, who was kind of a vain woman, was surrounded by mirrors. And the ceremonies that took place with dances and songs in honor of the Loas happened in a specific room called the peristyle. And in the middle of the peristyle, there would be a gigantic column called Potomatan. It was decorated with two serpents, which would be Dambalaweto and Idaweb. They would be united as if they were water and fire. And according to what they say, at the beginning of the ceremony, the Pantheon would serve as a bridge between Africa and the place of the ceremony, through which the entities, after a journey across the Atlantic, would use the Pantheon as the gateway to meet with their representatives at the place of the ceremony. Around the Pantheon, we would have the mambo or the ongun, the priest, the queen, and the singer, who would kind of lead the songs and dances, and the other participants of the ritual. Opposite this group, or facing them, we would also have an orchestra with 3 drums playing the rhythm of the loas to facilitate the trance or possession. And at the beginning of each ceremony, some symbols, drawings, or what are called vev, are also drawn on the ground with coffee or flour, which also symbolize the loas. And the emblems of the entities are also placed on a table, which is like an altar. And there are various objects, plates of food, mirrors, and even bottles which are said to contain the souls of the dead who are protected by the loas. The main places of worship there in Haiti are, for example, sovereigns and Sukkot. One really cool thing that usually happens is that, for example, during the patron saint festivals, they end up attracting a lot of voodoo practitioners, which ends up turning the event into a real voodoo pilgrimage. But what would be the nature of the loas? Are they good? Are they evil? Well, actually, they are neither one nor the other. The way they act in the lives of practitioners depends on how the practitioner follows the rules. The loas have a hierarchy, meaning some are more important than others. You sometimes need to focus more on certain loas, or you could face problems. If the temple we saw here is the gateway to the loas, the daily life of a voodoo practitioner is practically a family relationship with the spirits. When I say it's a family relationship, it's because it really is. There are even marriages with the spirits. In the case of Haiti, the religion is passed down through the family. Almost every family has the loa hazim, which is passed from father to son. They always keep a hidden corner in the room called wogatua, with the image of a Catholic saint, but there they actually talk to the ancestor, the family spirit. Like I said, there's marriage, the invisible marriage. Sometimes the relationship with the spirit gets so serious that a mystical marriage happens. If a person has a lot of bad luck or dreams too much about the spirit, they might end up marrying it, complete with a ring, even a party. The person gets powerful protection, but in return, they have to follow some rules, like, for example, not having sexual relations on certain days of the week, to respect the spiritual husband or wife. I told you this was serious. The ritual of blood and water, in this case, the spirits feel hunger, they feel thirst, and that's why every ceremony starts by pouring water on the ground. And it can also include the sacrifice of animals. To outsiders, it looks terrifying, but to them it's like preparing dinner for an honored guest. If the guest accepts the invitation, takes possession of someone, meaning that person goes into a trance, and the ceremony is considered a success. And also the protection of the head, or initiation, which is when someone decides to take it seriously, they become Oensai. The person is locked in the temple for weeks, learning the secrets of herbs and plants, and the goal is for the spirit to become fixed in their head, like a shield. And when the person dies, a special ritual is needed called Deisonem, which is to detach the spirit from the head of the deceased so that they can rest in peace. And we also have kind of secret societies, let's say, because in this case there are groups that act under the cover of night, like Bazango. They are like a kind of voodoo secret police. They are also led by an emperor, in quotes, and serve to protect the community and the temples. Because they're mysterious and punish those who break moral rules, they've gained a reputation as dangerous sorcerers, largely due to the villainous portrayal of such people in movies and cartoons. Well, in the past, doctors thought that people who went into a trance during these rituals were actually crazy. But today, anthropology actually explains that possession is actually a kind of language. When the spirit comes down into someone, it's not just shaking the body, it's communicating through specific dance steps, clothing, and objects as well. It's a way for the Haitian people to make sense of life's events, whether good or bad. In voodoo, it's also believed that the human body is open to spiritual forces. If it can receive a god, that is, a loa, it could also be the target of bad energies or envy, such as witchcraft. That's why initiation and mystical marriage work as a kind of protection. The practitioner does this not only for religious reasons, but to create a spiritual shield that protects their health and life against enemies. And now a spoiler about what I'm going to talk about in a moment, about the famous voodoo doll. But one important thing is that voodoo itself actually disapproves of evil witchcraft. Serious practitioners seek healing and protection. The idea of evil sorcerers does exist in voodoo, but actually they would be seen as someone who has strayed from the correct path of the religion. Well, in Africa, especially in Benin and Nigeria, 3 types of voodoo can be identified. One is associated with family or lineage, called Ino voodoo. Another is linked to the village, Tu voodoo, and one to a specific ethnic group there, Adu voodoo. The deities are divided into celestial groups, Mawu Lisa, who would be responsible for day and night, while Gu is in charge of organizing the universe. Then there are earthly groups such as Al or Agbe for the sea and waters, or Sotubu for the rain, and also those deities that represent the storm, such as Ogobadagre, the master of thunder. In the case of Saint-Domingue in Haiti, the African deities, called Loas, are divided between the Reda deities, who represent the Fon and Yoruba peoples, and the Congo and Petro deities for the Bantu peoples. And these specific ones represent the transformation of the group. They basically make up the new pantheon, the genuine pantheon. God is recognized as the great master, or also called Grame, who leaves the Loas, the secondary deities, with the task of dealing with earthly matters. The deities, therefore, mediate between humans and their world, representing for us an imaginary and symbolic field that serves as the basis for social relations and allows for mutual recognition among the enslaved and solidarity during revolts. The value of a loa in the pantheon is somewhat like that of a word in a language. Its value changes and can only be understood according to its relationship, or even the problems it has with another loa, or even with the family of deities. So, for example, Legba, who would be the leader of the Loas, and in this case, would be kind of the counterpart to Exu. For Candomblé, as I already mentioned, he opens the gate that separates humans from the world of spirits. Kind of because of that, he came to be syncretized with St. Peter. He is also the guardian of temples and homes, being invoked at the beginning of each ceremony. Legba is also the master of crossroads, places associated with danger, but which also house objects known as Vanga, which can protect against evil spirits and allow you to cast spells on others. Among the most important Loas is also Ogul, who is represented by St. James the Greater as a warrior. His favorite color is red, and he is associated with fire, but he also maintains contact with water. There he meets Azili, a sensual woman syncretized with the Virgin Mary and said to be his lover. Ogul is also a cousin of Zaka, who is the Loa of agriculture, whose adopted son is Pravijede, who is the spirit of the dead and of cemeteries. Many of these Loas are associated with a subdivision of voodoo, but in the Congo and Petro subdivisions, these spirits can also be present. But what I want to talk about here is also one that is actually quite well known, because in this case he appears in Smite, believe it or not. It's Baron Samedi. He would be the Loa of the dead, along with countless other incarnations of the Baron. For example, Baron Cemetery, Baron de la Cruz, and Baron Criminel. In this case, Samedi means Saturday in French, although there are other translations of the word. But anyway, Baron Samedi is usually described as a guy who wears a white hat, a black suit, dark glasses, and cotton plugging his nostrils. The key point is, he's a corpse, right? He's always ready for a funeral in the Haitian style. He has a white skull face and speaks with a nasal voice. Even for those who follow voodoo, Baron is seen as a dangerous spirit. But despite that, he can also be a powerful guardian, if he's in the mood to cooperate with that. Because of his sudden mood swings, he's labeled as a demon, or sometimes even as a god. Baron Samedi spends most of his time in the realm of the voodoo spirits. He is known for outrageous behavior, constantly swearing and making dirty jokes with other spirits. When someone dies, he digs their grave and greets their soul after they have been buried, guiding them to the underworld. Well, as you may have noticed, so far I haven't talked about the famous voodoo doll, but there's a reason for that, which is the following. After the Haitian Revolution, prejudice against voodoo ended. In the first half of the 19th century, the leaders of the Haitian government only tolerated voodoo. It was not an official religion. The official religion remained Catholicism. They tolerated it, recognizing voodoo's importance in the Haitian Revolution. But then another problem started to arise, which is this. The Haitian government and also the Vatican made an agreement, and Haiti started to receive some British missionaries to try to fully convert Haiti to Catholicism. You can probably guess what happened, right? It was an attempt to separate Voodoo from the Catholic Church because until then, Voodoo and Catholicism in Haiti were like this. They were really close together. No, that sounded weird. But anyway, you get it, they were closely linked. They blended together almost by osmosis, which the church disliked, saying that Voodoo was about cannibalism, about witchcraft, that those dances and those trances were actually the devil fighting inside people. Anyway, things you can probably imagine. That's when things fell apart. People rebelled, and the church, not wanting to lose followers, essentially reversed their decision. And they let the local churches kind of absorb the local culture, allowing Catholic voodoo to work by osmosis again. Okay, so where does the voodoo doll come into this story? Well, in one of the attempts to get people to give up voodoo, the voodoo doll appeared, which actually has nothing to do with voodoo. That doll doesn't even exist in voodoo. It was kind of an exaggeration that people made up to try to scare people and get them to give up voodoo. It's a puppet, a British doll, that's used in witchcraft from Britain. They made this doll, linked it to voodoo, and featured it in shows and cartoons to influence people. I mostly remember seeing this on Woody Woodpecker with Joe Crocodile playing drums and saying, "Vicky, Vicky, 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 chew." Then he carves a small Woody Woodpecker doll and plays with it. But actually, the voodoo doll isn't part of voodoo. Crazy, right? And if you watch the video up to here, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, like and share as well so more people can see it, and I'll see you next time.